He was a billionaire who had everything money could buy, except time. When his grandfather's will demanded he marry before the man's final birthday, he turned to the one woman he never expected to need, his secretary. Billionaire asked his secretary to be his fake fiancée until his grandfather's wish changed everything. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. If you love cinematic stories about love, redemption, and second chances, please click subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you will not miss our next episode on Billionaire Stories Untold. Now, let us return to our main character. The city never truly slept, but the 34th floor of Reid Enterprises was quieter than usual. The glow of Manhattan's skyline bled through the glass walls, silver and cold against the midnight blue. Alexander Reid sat alone at his desk, tie loosened, sleeves rolled to the elbows, the kind of fatigue only power could bring settling behind his eyes. He stared at the legal document in front of him, his grandfather's will. A single clause, underlined in red, felt like a sentence. He must be engaged before Edward Reid's 80th birthday, or the Reid estate transfers to the foundation board. He leaned back, the leather chair creaking softly. His reflection in the window looked like a stranger, successful, yes, but hollow. Then came the knock. 3 polite taps, hesitant but steady. "Come in," he said. Grace Miller stepped inside, clutching a folder to her chest. She was efficient, composed, the kind of woman who ran his world behind the scenes. Her dark hair was pinned neatly, her blouse slightly wrinkled from working late again. "You asked for the quarterly reports, Mr. Reid," she said. Alexander studied her for a moment longer than usual. He had built this empire on precision and distance. She had built her life on loyalty and quiet competence. And suddenly, an idea half ridiculous, half brilliant formed in his mind. "Grace," he began, his tone calm but measured, "I need a favor, a personal one." She froze. "Personal?" "Yes, I need you to pretend to be my fiancé." The silence that followed felt heavier than the marble floor beneath them. Grace blinked, uncertain she heard him correctly. "Excuse me?" He rose, crossing the room until the space between them was thin as breath. "It is not what you think. It is just for a few months. My grandfather's will requires it, and I trust you more than anyone else." Her throat went dry. "You are serious?" "Dead serious." He turned the document toward her, sliding it across the desk. Beneath the will was a second paper, his own draft of a contract. She read the first lines, her pulse quickening. Duration, 3 months. Public appearances only. Compensation to be discussed. Grace swallowed hard. "You want me to lie to your entire family?" "I want you to help me protect what my family built," he replied softly. "After this, you will never have to worry about your debts again." His voice was steady, but behind it she could hear something else. Fear, maybe loneliness, the cracks in a man used to having control. She thought of the hospital bills stacked on her kitchen counter, her mother's fading strength, the eviction notice taped to her door that morning. Pride battled practicality, but practicality was winning. "What happens after 3 months?" she asked quietly. "Then you walk away," he said. "No strings, no questions, no consequences." Alexander placed a velvet ring box on the desk between them. Inside was a diamond that caught the city lights and scattered them like fragments of glass. "Wear it when I tell you to," he said. Her fingers trembled as she closed the lid. "And what should I call you, Mr. Reid?" He looked at her, a hint of warmth breaking through the corporate mask. "If we are going to make this believable, you should start calling me Alexander." The clock on the wall ticked louder. Somewhere beyond those windows, the city kept breathing, unaware that a deal had just been struck, one that would blur the line between business and love forever. The morning after the agreement felt unreal. Grace woke up before sunrise, staring at the velvet ring box on her kitchen counter. The diamond inside caught the first beam of light slipping through the blinds, scattering it across the cracked walls of her small apartment. It looked out of place there, like something that belonged to another world. She traced a finger across the lid, half expecting to wake from a dream, but it was all real. She had agreed to become Alexander Reid's fake fiancé. At 9 sharp, she arrived at Reid Enterprises. The security guard greeted her as usual, but his curious glance lingered a little longer. News in this building traveled fast. She stepped into the private elevator, heart pounding. When the doors opened, Alexander was already there, standing by the panoramic window with his jacket perfectly tailored, the Manhattan skyline stretching behind him like a kingdom. "Good morning, Miss Miller," he said without turning. "Good morning, Alexander," she corrected herself, the name catching awkwardly in her throat. He turned then, expression unreadable, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Better. I have arranged a stylist, a photographer, and a publicist. We need to make this believable." Grace blinked. "You mean today?" He nodded once. "The press dinner for the Hale Foundation is tonight. My grandfather will be there. He must believe we are engaged." Her stomach twisted. "I do not even have a dress." "You will," he said, handing her a sleek black card. "Everything is taken care of." The day moved like a blur. The stylist's suite smelled of hairspray and expensive perfume. Grace stood still as a team transformed her new hair, subtle makeup, a soft navy gown that hugged her frame just right. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. That evening, a black car waited outside her building. Alexander stepped out as she approached, wearing a classic tuxedo that made him look like he had stepped out of a magazine. For a moment, his eyes softened. "You clean up well, Miss Miller." "So do you, Mr. Reid," she replied, half teasing. He opened the car door for her, a gesture both old-fashioned and disarming. The ride was quiet, the hum of the city fading beneath the steady rhythm of tires on asphalt. Grace stared out the window, palms sweating against the silk clutch in her lap. When they arrived at the gala, flashes exploded like fireworks. Photographers shouted Alexander's name. He placed a steadying hand on her back and leaned close enough for her to hear over the chaos. "Smile, and remember, we are in this together." His voice carried a warmth she had not expected. She lifted her chin and smiled as cameras clicked in a frenzy. Inside, chandeliers glimmered like captured stars, and the room buzzed with wealth and whispers. Alexander introduced her to a circle of executives and donors. Each handshake felt like a test. Grace smiled, nodded, and answered politely, repeating the story they had rehearsed in the car. They had met through the company, shared a passion for philanthropy, and got engaged privately to avoid the spotlight. It was going smoothly until someone asked, "So, Grace, when is the big day?" She froze. Alexander's hand found hers beneath the table, firm and reassuring. "We are still deciding," he said easily. "Some things are worth taking slow." His calm confidence steadied her, and for a fleeting moment, she forgot it was all an act. Later, she stepped aside for air, standing near the marble staircase. Across the hall, Alexander's grandfather, Edward Reid, sat in a wheelchair, his silver hair gleaming under the lights. His gaze found her. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other. Then the old man smiled, a faint, knowing curve of the lips that felt both kind and piercing. Grace exhaled. Something about that smile made her chest tighten, as if he could already see through the lie she was living. When Alexander joined her, his expression softened. "You did well tonight," he said quietly. "Did I?" He nodded. "Better than I expected." She laughed nervously, brushing a stray curl from her face. "High praise from my fake fiance." He smiled back. "Let us keep it convincing, shall we?" The car ride home was silent again, but different, less tense, almost fragile. Grace stared at the city lights blurring past, wondering how pretending to belong in his world could feel this dangerously real. The next morning, Grace walked into the office with the faint scent of champagne still clinging to her hair. The night at the gala had felt like a dream she could not shake off. Her phone buzzed constantly with new messages from people she barely knew, offering congratulations on her engagement. Every notification felt like a reminder of the lie she now had to live. When she stepped into Alexander's office, he was already there, standing behind his desk, sleeves rolled up, studying a set of papers. The morning light spilled through the tall windows, painting gold lines across the floor. "Morning," she said softly. He looked up, eyes calm but alert. "Morning. How are you holding up?" I am not sure, she admitted. Half the building thinks I just won the lottery. He smirked faintly. In a way, you did. She frowned. That is not funny. Alexander's expression softened. You handled yourself well last night. My grandfather was impressed. That is what matters. Grace hesitated. He looked at me like he already knew. Alexander paused, his tone quiet. He sees more than most people think. But for now, as far as he is concerned, we are engaged. That buys us time. He gestured toward the table. A thick stack of documents waited beside a sleek silver pen. What is this? She asked. The formal contract. Everything in. Writing terms, expectations, compensation. Grace pulled the chair closer and began to read. Each paragraph felt heavier than the one before. It detailed public appearances, confidentiality, and financial terms she could barely believe. She glanced up. You really thought of everything. He shrugged slightly. I do not leave things to chance. Her eyes landed on the final line. The relationship shall remain strictly professional, no emotional involvement. She read it twice before speaking. Strictly professional? Yes, he said. That clause protects both of us. Grace tried to smile, but it felt forced. Right. Just business. Alexander leaned forward, tapping his pen. If there is something that makes you uncomfortable, we can adjust it. No, she replied quickly. It is fine. I understand, he nodded once. Then sign here. The click of the pen echoed louder than she expected. As she signed her name, she felt the weight of it settle over her. This wasn't just a deal. It was a line she could never uncross. When she handed the contract back, Alexander's expression shifted. Good. From this moment on, everything we do will be watched. Every gesture, every word. Appearances are everything. Grace nodded slowly. Understood. That afternoon, they attended a lunch meeting with investors. Alexander was calm, controlled, the perfect image of a man in love. He pulled out her chair, brushed a hand against her arm when she spoke, smiled at her in ways that looked genuine enough to make her heart skip. Every touch was calculated, every glance rehearsed, but her pulse did not seem to understand the difference. After the meeting, they walked side by side through the marble lobby. Grace exhaled deeply. Do you ever get tired of pretending? He looked over at her. Pretending is how people survive in my world. She studied him for a long moment, seeing something raw beneath his confident surface. Maybe that is why your world feels so lonely. He did not answer. Instead, he held the elevator door for her and said quietly, I will have my driver take you home. That evening, Grace sat by her window, the city glowing below like a sea of stars. She turned the ring on her finger, watching how it caught the light. Every sparkle reminded her of the promise she had made, a promise that had nothing to do with love, yet somehow made her heart ache as if it did. Across town, Alexander stood on his penthouse balcony, phone in hand. His grandfather's doctor had called earlier. Edward Reid's health was declining faster than expected. The clock was ticking. The fake engagement that was meant to buy time was now running out of it. He looked toward the skyline, where somewhere Grace Miller was probably doing the same, wondering how long either of them could keep pretending before the truth began to show. The following weeks moved faster than Grace could comprehend. Between investor meetings, charity dinners, and interviews carefully staged by Alexander's publicist, she had learned to smile on command, answer politely, and hide the tremor in her hands whenever a camera flashed. Every morning brought another headline with their names, Billionaire heir, engaged to his secretary. Each word tightened the knot in her stomach. Despite the chaos, something unexpected was happening. The rehearsed moments between her and Alexander began to feel less like performance and more like rhythm. He no longer needed to remind her to take his arm or to laugh at his dry humor. They simply moved in sync. One evening, as the sky over Manhattan turned to rose gold, Alexander appeared at her desk. You are still here, he said. She smiled faintly without looking up from her laptop. Someone has to keep your empire from collapsing. He chuckled softly, a sound she had rarely heard from him. Come with me. There is something you should see. Before she could protest, he handed her a coat and led her to the elevator. Minutes later, they were standing on the rooftop terrace of the building. The wind carried the scent of rain and city smoke. Below them, the lights of New York stretched endlessly, alive and untamed. "I come here when I need to remember why I started all this," Alexander said quietly. "My father built this company from nothing. When he died, my grandfather made sure I never forgot what it cost him." Grace turned to look at him. For once, he was not the composed CEO or the cold billionaire. His eyes reflected exhaustion, loneliness, and something else, regret. "You do not have to keep proving yourself," she said softly. "You already did." He gave a small, sad smile. "That is not how men like me are raised." Silence filled the air between them. The city roared below, but up here it felt distant, unreal. Grace shivered slightly, and Alexander, without hesitation, slipped off his jacket and placed it over her shoulders. "Thank you," she murmured. He nodded, his gaze steady on her. "You should not have to pretend to belong in this world. You already do." Her breath caught, unsure how to answer. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting second, the contract, the rules, the lines they had drawn between them, none of it mattered. Then he stepped back, clearing his throat. "We have a board meeting in the morning," he said briskly. "Do not be late." But his voice trembled slightly, betraying what the words tried to hide. Later that night, Grace sat on her bed replaying the moment. She touched the sleeve of his jacket, still draped over her chair, and wondered what it meant when a man who promised not to feel anything started looking at her like that. The next day came with another test. The Foundation's annual press conference was packed with journalists. Reid, Alexander's grandfather, had decided to make a rare public appearance. Grace stood by. Alexander's side, her smile steady though her pulse raced. Edward's speech was warm but brief, his voice carrying the weight of decades. Then, turning toward them, he said, "I want to thank my grandson and his wonderful fiancée for reminding us that legacy is not just about wealth, but about family." Applause followed, cameras flashing again. Grace glanced at Alexander, and for once, he was not hiding behind a mask of composure. He looked proud of her, not the performance. After the event, Edward approached her privately. His hand trembled slightly as he held hers. "You have given him something I could not," he said. "Peace." Grace's throat tightened. "You are very kind, Mr. Reid." The old man smiled knowingly. "I am not kind. I am observant. Take care of him." That night, in the quiet of his office, Alexander stood by the window again, looking out at the city that had given him everything and taken just as much. Grace entered quietly, setting a cup of coffee on his desk. "You do not have to thank me," she said softly. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I was going to say thank you anyway." Their eyes lingered, and the silence between them stretched, delicate and dangerous. Somewhere beyond the glass, thunder rolled over the skyline, and Grace knew deep down whatever line they had drawn was beginning to blur. The rain arrived 2 days later, turning the city into a blur of silver and gray. Grace hurried through the lobby of Reid Enterprises, clutching her umbrella and balancing a stack of files. She had barely stepped into the elevator when her phone buzzed a message from Alexander. "Boardroom, now." When she entered, the room was already filled with executives. Alexander stood at the head of the long glass table, his presence sharp and composed, but his eyes flicked toward her as she closed the door. "Thank you for joining us, Miss Miller," he said, his tone professional. The meeting was intense. Investors were pressing for a new merger, one Alexander clearly opposed. His voice remained calm, measured, but the tension in his jaw told another story. Grace took notes silently, watching him navigate the politics of power with precision and restraint. When the meeting ended, most people left quickly. Grace stayed behind, gathering her papers. Alexander loosened his tie, rubbing a hand over his face. "Sometimes I think these meetings drain years off my life," he muttered. She smiled faintly. "You handled it better than anyone else could." He looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment the air changed. "You always say that," he said softly. "Why do you still believe in me, Grace?" She hesitated. "Because underneath all of this, you are still the man who gives his jacket to someone standing in the cold." He blinked, surprised by her answer, then smiled faintly. "You should not remember things like that. I cannot seem to forget," she whispered. For a long second, neither of them moved. Then the door opened, and a familiar voice broke the silence. "Am I interrupting?" It was Edward Reid, his grandfather, being wheeled in by an assistant. His smile was gentle, but his eyes sharp. "I hope I am not intruding on something private." Alexander straightened. "Of course not, grandfather." Edward studied them both, amusement tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good, because I wanted to see how my favorite couple was doing. I have decided something important." Grace's pulse quickened. "What is it, sir?" "I want the engagement celebration to be held here, at the estate," Edward said firmly. "This weekend." Alexander froze. "That soon?" "I am not as young as I used to be," Edward said with a soft chuckle. "If I am going to dance at my grandson's engagement, it should happen while I still can." Grace smiled gently. "That sounds lovely." Edward nodded approvingly. "Good, girl. I will leave the details to you two." When he was gone, the room felt smaller. Alexander exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "He is making it impossible to keep this act contained." Grace frowned. "You mean the party?" "I mean the lie," he said. "Every day, it grows bigger. Every word we say around him becomes another thread we have to untangle later." She looked down, fingers tightening around her notebook. "Then maybe we should stop thinking of it as a lie. Maybe we just play our parts well enough to make it real for a while." He studied her carefully. "You think this could ever be real?" "I think we are already pretending less than we used to," she said quietly. Alexander said nothing. Instead, he stepped closer, his hand brushing against hers as he reached for the contract lying on the table. The contact sent a spark through her that neither of them could ignore. That night, preparations began for the engagement celebration. Grace oversaw the guest list and decorations, while Alexander handled logistics with his staff. They worked late into the night, side by side. Occasionally, their hands brushed, their voices softened, and the lines between professionalism and affection faded further. When they finally left, the rain had stopped. Alexander walked her to her car, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder. The streetlights painted their reflections in puddles along the curb. "Thank you for staying late," he said. "Thank you for trusting me with all this," she replied. He hesitated, then reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Do not thank me. You are the only one I trust." Grace felt her heart stutter. "You are not supposed to say things like that, Alexander." "I know," he said quietly. "But lately, I am not sure what I am supposed to say anymore." As she drove home that night, the city lights shimmered through the windshield like falling stars. She told herself it was all part of the act, but her heart no longer believed that. The lie was becoming the truth, and both of them knew it. The weekend came faster than either of them expected. The Reid estate, a sprawling mansion on the Hudson River, shimmered under strings of golden lights. Staff hurried across the marble halls, arranging bouquets, candles, and crystal glasses for the engagement celebration that was never meant to be real. Grace arrived early, her navy gown catching the late afternoon sunlight. She had barely stepped through the doors when Alexander appeared at the top of the staircase. For a moment, she forgot to breathe. He was in a tailored black suit, his expression unreadable, his eyes lingering on her longer than they should have. "You look stunning," he said softly. Grace smiled nervously. "You do not look so bad yourself, Mr. Reid," he chuckled. "Alexander, you promised to call me Alexander." Their laughter eased the tension, but beneath it, something fragile and unspoken simmered. As guests began to arrive, the estate filled with music and polite conversation. Reporters snapped photos, guests exchanged champagne toasts, and everywhere Grace turned, someone whispered her name. She smiled, posed, and played her part flawlessly. When the speeches began, Edward Reid motioned for silence. The old man's voice carried through the ballroom with gentle authority. "I have watched my grandson build his legacy with ambition and courage, but tonight, I see something even greater joy." He looked at Grace, his gaze warm and knowing. "Grace, you have brought light into his life. For that, I thank you. Applause followed, and Grace felt her throat tighten. Alexander stood beside her, his hand resting over hers for the cameras. To everyone else, it looked like a picture of love. To her, it felt dangerously close to being real. Later that evening, after most of the guests had moved to the terrace, Grace slipped away to catch her breath. She found herself wandering through the quiet halls until she reached the old library. The air smelled of leather and cedar. Shelves stretched high above her, filled with decades of history. She ran her fingers across the spines of the books, lost in thought, until she heard footsteps behind her. "I was wondering where you went," Alexander said softly. "I needed a moment," she replied, turning to face him. "It is hard pretending when everyone looks at you like you belong here." He stepped closer, his voice low. "You do belong here, more than most of them." Grace shook her head. "You do not mean that." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small velvet ring box. This was supposed to be just a symbol, a tool to get through the next few months. He opened it, the diamond catching the flicker of candlelight. "But every time I see you wearing it, I forget it is not real." Her heart pounded. "Alexander, do not—" He took another step, closing the space between them. "Tell me this is still pretend. Tell me you feel nothing when I look at you like this." Grace tried to speak, but no words came. The silence was louder than the storm beginning to roll outside. Thunder echoed distantly as rain began to tap against the window. Finally, she whispered, "We made rules. You said no feelings, no complications. And I was a fool to think I could keep them," he said. Somewhere between all the lies, I started telling myself the truth. Grace's breath trembled. "This is not part of the contract." "No," he admitted. "It is not, but maybe it should have been." He reached out, brushing a raindrop from her cheek, though it was really a tear. For the first time, neither of them hid. Then, from the hallway, they heard the sound of voices, Edward's aide calling for Alexander. The moment shattered like glass. Alexander straightened quickly, slipping the ring box back into his pocket. "We should go. He needs me." Grace nodded, her chest tight. "Of course." They walked back toward the ballroom, side by side, but the distance between them had changed forever. The storm outside raged on, and Grace knew that no matter how carefully they had drawn their lines, the rain had already washed them away. The storm outside refused to end that night. Thunder rolled over the Hudson, shaking the glass walls of the ballroom as the celebration began to wind down. Grace stood near the window, pretending to listen to a conversation she could barely hear. Her mind was still in the library, replaying every word Alexander had said. Across the room, Alexander was speaking quietly with his grandfather's aide when the first flash of cameras hit. A reporter had somehow slipped past security. "Mr. Reid, is it true your engagement is a business deal? That your fiancé used to be your employee?" The question cut through the music like a blade. The room fell silent. Grace froze as the crowd turned toward them. Alexander's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, another reporter shouted, "We have sources who saw the contract!" Gasps spread like wildfire. Grace's chest constricted. Every eye was on her, filled with curiosity and judgment. She wanted to run, but her feet would not move. Alexander stepped forward, his voice calm but cold. "That will be enough. This is a private event." But the damage was done. Edward Reid, seated near the stage, looked confused, then hurt. "Alexander," he said softly, "what are they talking about?" Alexander opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The truth was too complicated, too cruel. Grace swallowed hard, stepping forward. "It is my fault," she said quietly. "It started as an agreement. I needed the job, and he needed someone to help him." Edward's expression fell. "So none of it was real?" Grace shook her head slowly. "I wanted to protect him, but somewhere along the way, I stopped pretending." Her voice broke on the last word. She turned, tears burning behind her eyes, and hurried out into the rain before anyone could stop her. Alexander stood frozen, the world around him collapsing into silence. Cameras flashed again, reporters shouted his name, but he heard nothing. All he could see was the door she had walked through. By the time he reached the driveway, her car was gone. Rain drenched his suit, but he did not care. Inside the house, Edward's aide helped the old man to his feet, his face pale with disappointment. "You lied to me, Alexander," Edward said, his voice weak but firm. "You lied about the one thing that mattered, love." Alexander turned, rain dripping from his hair. "Grandfather, please, I can explain." But Edward shook his head, eyes clouded with sorrow. "I do not need explanations. I needed honesty." Those words hit harder than any accusation could. Alexander stood motionless as the old man was helped back inside, the lights of the mansion glowing faintly behind him. The storm roared louder, echoing the chaos in his chest. For the first time, the man who had always been in control realized he had lost the only thing that was ever real. The next morning, the mansion felt hollow. The staff moved quietly, afraid to disturb the silence that had settled after the scandal. The headlines were everywhere, photos from the engagement party, captions calling Grace a fraud and Alexander a liar. The story had spread across every business channel in New York. Alexander sat alone in his study, staring at the contract that had started it all. The paper was wrinkled, smudged with rain from the night before. Every word felt like a mistake carved in ink. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from board members, lawyers, and reporters, but he ignored them all. Nothing mattered now except one thing: finding Grace. He called her apartment. No answer. He sent messages. None delivered. Finally, he called the hospital where her mother had been treated, but they said Grace had checked her mother out that morning and left no forwarding address. She was gone. Edward Reid had refused to see him since the night of the party. The doctor had warned that stress could worsen his heart condition. Alexander stood outside his grandfather's room anyway, waiting. When the nurse finally let him in, Edward was sitting by the window, his expression distant. "Grandfather," Alexander began softly, "I made a mistake." Edward did not look at him. "You made many, but which one are you here to fix?" "The one that cost me her," Alexander said. "I never meant to hurt anyone. I thought I could control everything, but she changed that. I love her." The old man turned then, his eyes tired but sharp. "If that is true, then do not waste time talking to me. Go prove it to her." Alexander nodded once, emotion tightening his throat. He left the estate, rain still misting the air, and drove through the city until the sky began to clear. Hours passed before he finally found her Grace, standing outside a small art studio in Brooklyn, a for lease sign in the window. She turned when she heard the sound of his car door closing. Her expression was guarded, tired. "How did you find me?" "I looked everywhere," he said quietly. "You said you wanted to start something real. I thought this was where you would come." Grace crossed her arms. "You should not be here, Alexander. The company, your reputation." "I do not care about any of that," he interrupted. "I only care about what I broke." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the crumpled contract. Then, without a word, he struck a lighter and set the edge of the paper on fire. The flames climbed quickly, turning every clause, every lie, into ash. Grace watched, silent. "When I asked you to pretend," he said, his voice low, "I thought I was buying time, but you were the only real thing in my life. I cannot lose you." Her eyes shimmered, tears threatening to fall. "You cannot erase what happened with fire, Alexander." "No," he said, stepping closer, "but maybe I can start over with the truth this time." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind carried the last embers of the burning paper into the gray sky. Grace looked down at the ashes, then back at him. "You always did know how to make a scene," she whispered, half smiling through her tears. He smiled faintly. "Then let this be my first honest one." And for the first time since it all began, she did not walk away. A few months later, spring returned to New York. The city was alive again, streets blooming with color, the air soft with the promise of renewal. At the Reid Foundation's annual gala, a familiar pair stood on the stage, this time without pretenses, without scripts. Grace wore a simple white dress, her hair falling in soft waves. Alexander stood beside her in a dark suit, his hand steady in hers. The cameras flashed again, but the energy in the room was different now. There was no secret to hide, no lie to protect, only the truth they had fought to earn. Edward Reid sat in the front row, his health improving, his smile proud. When the applause quieted, Alexander took the microphone. "A year ago," he began, "I thought leadership was about control. I thought love was something that could be managed or negotiated. I was wrong. Real leadership begins with humility. Real love begins when you stop pretending." He turned toward Grace, his voice softening. "This woman taught me both. I asked her once to be my fake fiancé, but she became my real home." The audience erupted in applause. Grace blinked back tears as Alexander reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, not the same one from their contract, but a new one, simple and unpolished, chosen by him. He knelt before her, his voice trembling just enough for the microphone to catch it. "Grace Miller, will you marry me for real this time?" Her answer came with a smile that lit up the entire room. "Yes, for real." Laughter and applause filled the hall. Edward wiped a tear discreetly, whispering to the person beside him, "Now, that is a promise worth keeping." Weeks later, under the same oak tree on the Reid estate where it had all begun, they exchanged their vows in a quiet ceremony. No press, no board members, no contracts, just family, friends, and the gentle rustle of wind through the leaves. Grace's mother watched from the front row, healthy and glowing. Alexander slipped a silver band onto Grace's finger, his hands steady. "No rules," he said softly. "No time limits, just us." Grace smiled through her tears. "I can live with that." When the officiant declared them husband and wife, Alexander kissed her, and the crowd erupted in joy. The old velvet ring box, the one that had started everything, sat on a nearby table, now holding the ashes of the burned contract. As the sun set over the river, Grace looked up at Alexander and whispered, "You kept your grandfather's wish." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "He wanted me to find someone who loved me for who I am. I think I finally did." And as the light faded behind them, the man who once made love a transaction held in his arms, the woman who turned it into truth, proving that sometimes the most beautiful things begin with a lie and end with forever.